All right, thanking God and praising him this time for his motives in the counsel he offers us. Let's call this chapter Exalted, understanding that once again, he is going to address part, if not all of this chapter to the tribe of Ephraim, a tribe who he is now going to hold responsible for some of the choices they make while they are exalted amongst the nations or the tribes of Israel. Verse 1 saying, when Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. He was exalted in Israel. Ephraim's influence seeming to extend through verse 2's description of the way that idolatry seemed to proliferate throughout Israel. However, as we saw in the last chapter, winning wrong comes at a cost, and verse 3 is going to help them see that any gains they make are simply going to be temporary. Following the ESV's paragraph breaks, verse 4 is going to seem to mark the next paragraph in which God is going to remind them that there is no genuine Savior besides him. And no matter how much they look for an alternative, truth, to the degree they're actually interested in it, is always going to lead them back to God. The idols and the images, however, gave them an excuse to seek out an alternative. In the meantime, God was the one who was actually providing for them, but that led to them becoming even more inflated in their ego. It's literally going to say in verse 6, their heart was lifted up the more he provided for them, leading them once again to turn on God. Verse 7 is going to say, therefore he became to them, or say he became to them like a lion, like a leopard. He will lurk beside the way. Verse 8, I will fall on them like a bear. It's going to seem kind of cruel until you get to verse 9, where it's literally going to say that once again, it seems that God eventually got tired of them turning on him. Therefore, he became as an enemy to them, a theme we have seen going back to previous prophets before Hosea. Picked up again here in chapter 13, where verse 10 is going to go on to question, where is your king who ultimately was like their idols, just another alternative to God that they sought out for salvation? An alternative that, like their idols, would simply once again leave them disappointed. As verse 11 says, I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. Verse 12, going forward to say that Ephraim's consequences are kept in store no matter how remote they might seem. Verse 13 is saying that if they were wise, they would have been guided to seek God from their youth, reminding me of what we saw back in chapter 12, talking about the days of Jacob, when from the womb he was contending with his brother. God saying that going all the way back to the days when Jacob was a child, much like he said in Deuteronomy, train up the children in the way that they should go. And when they are old, that's the New Testament equivalent of what Deuteronomy said to the people when they were counseled to teach their children healthy habits from an early age so that they don't have to suffer what God is talking about here, the consequences of habits they were simply allowed to get into because they weren't guided in making healthy choices. Verse 14, seeming to pause to question, should he ransom them from the choices that seem to lead to death or Sheol? Going on in verse 15 to say, though they may flourish or win wrong. Once again, they are not going to win wrong for long. Or like we saw with this conversation or the verse about Ephraim, their consequences are still stored up no matter how remote they might seem. Verse 15 through the end of the chapter, in particular, verse 15 saying that though he may flourish among his brothers, God is going to strip his treasury and sweep his gains away, reminiscent of what we saw in the last chapter. This chapter, however, for whatever reason, it seemed to remind me that beyond simply punishing them for the choice to make an idol, God seems to hold them accountable for the damage done by their idolatry and by the kings they demanded. Understanding that beyond the choices of those kings, their idolatry freed them from God's counsel, but it allowed them to make a whole bunch of choices that had consequences they didn't always foresee. And so God's words to the people of Ephraim seem to give us another perspective on the way in which their freedom to do things their way did not free them from the consequences being stored up as their freedom began to harm others.